In the last episode of Summa Made Simple, we jumped forward in our discussion around temperance to the virtues of fasting and abstinence. That was because we were starting Lent and we had just had Ash Wednesday a couple of days before that. So jumped forward to fasting and abstinence because it was pretty relevant. But now we're dialing back and we're going back to our discussion around temperance in itself and virtues and vices against temperance. And today we will be discussing one of the vices against temperance, or rather one of the forms of the vice of intemperance, which is, the vice against temperance is intemperance. And it's actually such a rare vice, and it's the vice of insensibility. It's so rare, even just that name, insensibility. Like, you don't come across it in day-to-day speech, right? How often you find people saying, "Oh, that person is insensible," and if they do use it, they're not using it in the sense in which St. Thomas Aquinas is speaking about that word insensibility. So I thought, maybe I don't even know if it's worthwhile doing this episode, but then I thought to myself, you know what? There are a lot of insights and gems in his conversation around insensibility, especially in terms of this understanding that virtues and vices have less to do with quantity and more to do with quality, meaning it has to do with how much you shape or you form a desire according to right reason. Let's get into it. And I wanted to start with something a little bit different this week. I wanted to start by reading. So St. Thomas Aquinas, we're looking at question 142, Article 1, or the vices opposed to temperance. And he's going to covers it in 4 points of inquiry. Where the first one is whether insensibility is a sin. And that's what we're looking at, whether insensibility is a sin. Now, there's a big difference between a sin and a vice. And there's something here which I don't fully understand, because in the sort of table of contents, it asks whether insensibility is a sin. In the article itself, the heading is rephrased as whether insensibility is a vice. But I think it's even more telling, that first question, whether insensibility is a sin. That just carries more weight. It's like, okay, there's some stakes involved here, right? If insensibility is a sin. I wanted to start by reading something which Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, speaking about insensibility. And in it, he gives a definition and an explanation of what insensibility is. And that gives us a groundwork so that right from the beginning, we know exactly what we're talking about as we go into this conversation or this debate into what insensibility is and whether or not it is a sin. I'm reading now from the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. It does not happen too often that men become deficient in pleasure, taking less enjoyment than they ought. Insensibility of this kind is not in keeping with human nature, because the other animals differentiate foods in this, that they take pleasure in some things, and in others they do not. If someone finds no joy in anything, and does not prefer one thing to another, he is a long way from being human. As this rarely happens, there is no special name for it. I wanted to quote from Aristotle because St. Thomas Aquinas bases a lot of what he says about insensibility on this particular paragraph from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And that paragraph gives us an explanation of what insensibility is and why it is a vice against the virtue of temperance, why insensibility is a form of intemperance. Basically, what is insensibility? If someone finds no joy in anything and does not prefer one thing to another, then he is a long way from being human. In other words, they're a long way from being rational, because being rational is what ultimately makes us humans. Otherwise, if we were irrational, we'd simply be the same as animals. There'd be nothing that distinguishes us. Let's get into what St. Thomas Aquinas says about this particular point. First article, whether insensibility is a sin. We proceed thus to the first article, objection 1. It would seem that insensibility is not a sin. Actually, let me pause here and just ask you, dear reader, please read along with what I'm reading, because I put a link in the show notes to the exact text which I'm reading. So read along, because it really helps to understand. It will help you to understand what it is that we're reading and what it is that we're explaining as we go along. Objection 1, it would seem that insensibility is not a vice, for those are called insensible who are deficient with regard to pleasures of touch. Now, seemingly it is praiseworthy and virtuous to be altogether deficient in such matters, for it is written in the book of Daniel, in those days I, Daniel, mourned the days of 3 weeks. I ate no desirable bread, and neither flesh nor wine entered my mouth, neither was I anointed with ointment. Therefore, insensibility is not a sin. In other words, since the pleasures of touch, which is what temperance concerns itself with, lead us so much into sin, then, surely, if we avoid the pleasures of touch, then it's not going to lead us into sin. And even we have some precedent of that in Scripture. That's what that first objection is saying. Objection 2, further, man's good is to be in accord with reason, according to Dionysius. Now, abstinence from all pleasures of touch is most conducive to man's progress in the good of reason. And again, he quotes from the book of Daniel. Therefore, insensibility, which rejects those pleasures of touch, which pull us away from the good of reason, is not sinful. So this is a lot like that first objection. And then objection 3, further, that which is very effective, that which is a very effective means of avoiding sin, would seem not to be sinful. Now, the most effective remedy in avoiding sin is to shun pleasures. And this pertains to insensibility, the shunning of pleasures. And that helps us to avoid sin. For the philosopher says in Ethics that if we deny ourselves pleasures, we are less liable to sin. Therefore, there is nothing vicious, there is nothing sinful, nothing of a vice in insensibility. On the contrary, this is St. Thomas now speaking, nothing except vice is opposed to virtue. Now, insensibility is opposed to the virtue of temperance, according to the philosopher in Ethics, Book 2, Lecture 7, and Book 3, Lecture 2. Therefore, insensibility is a vice. I answer that. So this is St. Thomas's response, explaining why this inability to take pleasure in the pleasures of touch is a vice or a sin, or rather, let's say not inability, but more like a refusal to enjoy the pleasures of touch. A refusal to enjoy the pleasures of touch that is not in keeping with good reason is a sin. This is what St. Thomas says. I answer that whatever is contrary to the natural order is vicious. Now, nature has introduced pleasure into the operations that are necessary for man's life. In other words, by nature, things which we need to do so that we can stay alive and so that we can keep the human race alive, those things have a pleasure attached to them. Think of it as a kind of incentive. If eating and drinking were not pleasurable, if sex was not pleasurable, we would have very little incentive to partake in them, and we could just end up dead, either as an individual or as a species. Wherefore, the natural order requires that man should make use of these pleasures insofar as they are necessary for man's well-being, as regards the preservation either of the individual or of the species. Accordingly, if anyone were to reject pleasure to the extent of omitting things that are necessary for nature's preservation, he would sin as acting counter to the order of nature. And this pertains to the vice of insensibility. Let's give some examples so that we can try and unpack what he's saying here. Because what he's saying is, nature, for us to remain alive, there's certain things we have to do. Now, to motivate us and incentivize us to do those things which we need to do so that we can stay alive, there's pleasure attached to those things. And it's rational. It would make sense. This thing is so important, so let's inject some pleasure so that you've got the motivation to do it, right? Now, if a person were to shun that pleasure, to look down on that pleasure, to reject that pleasure in that thing, that goes against reason, because reason puts pleasure into that so that we can have an incentive or a motive to actually do those things which keep us alive. If you look down on the pleasure of food, drink, or sex, then, and not in keeping with right reason, that's very important, not in keeping with right reason, that is the vice, that is the sin. This is, when I was reading this, the first thing which came to mind was, and maybe it's not exactly a perfect correlation, but there are a number of people I know who, they look down on, for instance, the pleasure of that one gets from drinking alcohol, like for instance, drinking wine, that said never ever touch wine. And again, it depends on the reason why they don't touch wine or alcohol. If they were to say, listen, I used to be an alcoholic, and it's been X number of days since I touched alcohol, and I know if I touch this thing, I'll go down a very slippery slope and I won't know what happens next, then there's actually a good reason for doing that. So what they're doing is in keeping with right reason. And actually, that's what St. Thomas speaks about in the next paragraph there. It must, however, be observed that it is sometimes praiseworthy and even necessary for the sake of an end to abstain from such pleasures as result from these operations. Thus, for the sake of the body's health, certain persons refrain from pleasures of meat, drink, and sex, also for the fulfillment of certain engagements. Thus, athletes and soldiers have to deny themselves many pleasures in order to fulfill their respective duties. In like manner, penitents, in order to recover health of soul, have recourse to abstinence from pleasures as a kind of diet, and those who are desirous of giving themselves up to contemplation and divine things need much to refrain from carnal things. Nor do any of these things pertain to the vice of insensibility, because they are in accord with right reason. That is so important. Things being in accord with right reason. So if a person says, listen, I cannot touch alcohol because I know either I'm an alcoholic or I come from a family of alcoholics and I know this is just going to lead me down a very slippery slope, that is in accord with right reason. If a person says, I'm not going to touch alcohol because I'm Christian, I would argue that's not in accord with right reason. Why? Because if you're a Christian, you're a follower of Jesus Christ, right? And you have to ask yourself, why did Jesus Christ then, who is God, and God is good, why would Jesus Christ, as his first miracle, turn water into wine and then command someone to take that wine to the steward of the wedding feast and tell him to taste it? If drinking wine was sinful, that means God actually commanded someone to commit a sin. Is that in accord with right reason? I don't know. Look, long story, it's not. It's not. It's a complete misunderstanding. Over and above that, one could always cite the example of Paul, when Paul was writing to Timothy, and he told Timothy, listen, from time to time, drink a little bit of wine because it's going to help you with your digestive issues. Because, wine helps people in a limited extent, wine does have some health benefits. This is what St. Paul tells St. Timothy in his letter to Timothy, drink wine from time to time. Would Paul ask a bishop whom he has installed in a place to commit a sin if drinking wine was a sin? So if someone looks down on a pleasure that comes from food, drink, or sex, without right and heck, in fact, I was going to say looks down on a pleasure from food, drink, or sex without right reason. Like the moment you put in right reason, it ceases to be looking down. It's no longer shunning something. It's turning away from something. But looking down has this element of disdain in it. And once you have that disdain element into the reason why you reject the pleasure of food, drink, or sex, that you look down on it, it means, number one, right reason is not there. It's almost as though you're disrespecting a creation of God, because God is the one who puts the pleasures there and he is the divine logos. He is reason itself. So you're kind of going against God. So when you disdain those things, that's when it becomes against right reason, and it is a sin. Another example which came to mind, and perhaps this is now even closer to this, is, as Catholics, there's this thing called confession that we do, that we're supposed to do, where it's one of the 7 sacraments of the church, which Christ instituted when he said, whoever sins you forgive, they're forgiven. Whoever sins you retain, they're retained. And through that, he instituted a sacrament, which is a visible channel of invisible grace. Long story short, how do you know when you ask God for forgiveness that you've actually been forgiven? Because that's an invisible thing. So how do you know an invisible thing has actually happened? So you need a visible way. You need a sign. That's what the sacraments are. They are signs that something invisible has actually happened. You get confirmation that your sins have been forgiven if you go to confession and you do it correctly. That's just a very brief explanation of what confession is. Now, when Catholics prepare for confession, you've got this list of questions of things areas where I may have sinned. There's a specific list of questions for married couples when they're preparing for confession. And one of the questions there is, have I denied my spouse, my husband or my wife, their conjugal rights? Have I denied them? And if a person denies their spouse their conjugal rights, then that is a sin. potentially a sin, very likely a sin if they've denied them. And if they've denied them because they look down on the pleasure, if they look down on the pleasure that is associated with sex, it is this precise thing. It is the vice opposed to temperance, which is the vice of insensibility, the sin of insensibility. So it's actually something to take to confession and to ask for forgiveness for. Let's move on to the objections. Reply to objection 1. Remember that first objection is where it is seemingly praiseworthy and virtuous to be altogether, to cut down all the pleasures of touch. And it gives the example from the book of Daniel. And the reply to that objection is, Daniel abstained thus from pleasures, where if he fasted, he refused to eat, etc., etc. Daniel abstained thus from pleasures, not through any horror of pleasure, as though it were evil in itself. And again, there we have another description of what insensibility is. A horror of pleasures as though pleasures were evil in themselves, but for some praiseworthy end, in order, namely, to adapt himself to the heights of contemplation by abstaining from pleasures of the body. So there we have right reason. He's not disdaining the pleasures of food and drink. It's because he accepts them and he says, these are good things, but there's even a higher goal. So I'm not looking down on them. I'm just seeking something that's different, something that's higher. I'm not putting them down in any way, shape, or form. Hence, the text goes on to tell of the revelation that he received immediately afterwards. Second objection, further, man's good is in accord with right reason, according to Dionysius, and abstinence from all pleasures of touch is most conducive to man's progress in the good of reason. Therefore, insensibility, which rejects these pleasures of touch, is not sinful. What is St. Thomas's reply to that? Since man cannot use his reason without his sensitive powers, that is so important. That is so important. Man cannot use his reason without his sensitive powers, which need a bodily organ, as stated in the first part. Man needs to sustain his body in order that he may use his reason. They're just like, carve that into your mind, into your heart. Never forget this connection between the body and the soul, because as there's always that risk of looking down on the body and disdaining the body and saying the body is a useless thing that, it just leads me to sin. But that's not the case. We're constructed of both realities, the body and the soul, and they need each other. This is so important to understand. Now, the body is sustained by means of operation that afford pleasure. Wherefore, the good of reason cannot be in a man if he abstains from all pleasures. That is so heavy. Wherefore, the good of reason cannot be in a man if he abstain from all pleasures. Yet, this need for using pleasures of the body will be greater or less according as man needs more or less the powers of his body in accomplishing the act of reason. Put it this way. If a person is a monk, spends all his day praying, he's going to require much less the pleasures. He's going to need them less. Let's call it the pleasures of eating or drinking, and sex, never at all. He's going to need them because they're not in keeping with his actual duty, what he's supposed to do. If this guy is going to be a construction worker and he has to lug, I don't know how many bags of cement up a scaffolding to put bricks, whatever. I mean, he needs a lot of physical energy. He cannot afford to look down on the pleasures of eating, because if he does, that is going to actually go against the good of reason, which directs him towards his end goal or his objective as a bricklayer. Yet this need for using pleasures of the body will be greater or less according as man needs more or less the powers of his body in accomplishing the act of reason. Wherefore, it is commendable for those who undertake the duty of giving themselves to contemplation and of imparting to others a spiritual good, by a kind of spiritual procreation, as it were, to abstain from many pleasures, but not for those who are in duty bound to bodily occupations and carnal procreation. Reply to objection 3. Objection 3 was abstaining from pleasures of touch is a very effective means of avoiding sin. So it cannot be sinful. And his reply to that objection is, in order to avoid sin, pleasure must be shunned, not altogether, but so that it is not sought more than necessity requires. I just want to end off with an anecdote. I remember once reading about I don't know if it was, I could be mistaken. I don't know if it's Puritanism or, and you know, the problem with using the word Puritanism is that Puritanism as a theological movement in the Protestant church is very wide, and it actually has some theological basis to it. It's not just saying, hey, we don't touch alcohol, we don't enjoy physical pleasure. There's actually like some theological basis to it. But I'll use it because it's a term that many people perhaps would understand in this context of shunning pleasure. There have been movements in Christianity where people say, oh, you just have to shun pleasure and not have a good time, and Christianity is a sad religion. And sometimes the word Puritanism has been applied to this way of looking at or living out the Christian faith. I read an anecdote about Saint John the Evangelist, you know, the disciple, one of the 12 disciples, that one day he and his disciples were just chilling, just relaxing, playing some outdoor games sometime, and someone from the city came across them, you know, just having a good time outdoors. And then he was a little bit surprised and a little bit shocked and said, aren't you guys supposed to be like, you know, like praying? And Saint John the Evangelist, according to the legend, told him, if a bow is always kept taut, if a bow is always kept in a high state of tension, in other words, it's going to break. And from time to time, we have to loosen the bowstring so that the bow can retain its suppleness. It's the same thing. It's alluding to that same general idea that God created pleasures and put them in certain human operations. And for us to be fully human, we have to accept and enjoy those pleasures within the limits of right reason, and shunning those pleasures, whether it be of food or drink or sex or play or enjoyment, is actually dehumanizing ourselves.